All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Afreilich Chanukah to everyone. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev. Josh and Becca Friedman for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month. Le'ilui Nishmas Josh's father Yisrael Yehuda ben Rav Chaim Rafael Zichron Levracha. To thank Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month in memory of their parents. Yitzchok Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, and in the schus of the continued Gesund and Hatzlacha from Mr. Esterson, Ad Mea Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. The Pepper family dedicating the Shurim this month in commemoration of the yard site of Yosef Pepper, Yosef David Zichron Levracha ben Yaakov. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Richard and Lauren Mayer, in honor of Milt Gertner, with appreciation for getting Lauren the Daf Shir handouts and notebooks, which has made staying on top of the Daf for the last 3 years so much easier. Thank you, Milt. Beautiful. And Akiva and Leah Wexelbaum in loving memory of their Oma Chana Bas Naftali. And an anonymous sponsorship in the Schus of Shlema for Shmuel Moshe ben Cyril Middle, who is having surgery today. We also thank Judy and Rachmiel Nudelman for dedicating the shir today in the Schus of a complete Shlema for Mr. Marvin Schwartz, who is undergoing a medical procedure today. Meretz Hashem, all should proceed with mazel. And we'll see with that, let us begin, or let us continue, I should say. Today's daf is Nun Ches 58, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Nun Zayin Amud Beis 57b. And we left off as follows. We left off Hadar Asa Lekame. So we'll say it's 2, 4, 6 lines up on the bottom on 57b. So if you remember again, we were dealing with the interesting question that came up from Yishmael. So Yishmael, this individual Yishmael from the village of Yama, came forward with a question. What was his question? If a person goes ahead and takes an onion that had a bulb, it was a bulb of a Shemitah onion, and replanted it, and then again the onion grew additionally, and let's say the new growth. So now we have eighth year growth. So do the if the 8-year growth outnumber the 7th year growth, so do they have the ability to be mavatal it? So we've gone back and forth with this question. And this question, of course, has many ramifications, not just for Shemitah, but ultimately, again, for various types of prohibitions. If you have what we'll call a prohibited core, and then you go and you replant that prohibited core, and now as a result of that replanting, there are many new layers of, we'll call it, permitted additions. Do the permitted additions, are they mevatel the original prohibited core? So we've seen this discussion kind of go back and forth with different opinions. So we left off as follows. Hadar Asla Kamei Rabbi Ami, Upashat Le Min Hada. So they finally came before Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami tried to resolve this question from the following case. Am Rabbi Yischak, Am Rabbi Yochanan, Litra B'Tzalam Shetikna V'Zara, Mis Asharas Lefikula. So this is a very interesting case. Litra is an amount. You have a litra of onions. Shetikna. I will say this means that they were tithed. So you have a litra of onions which were tithed, and what happens? Shetikna V'Zara. Then you went ahead and you replanted it. So now as a result of replanting it, what happened? Now you have new growth. So what's the halacha? Now we'll say what the Gemara presupposes in this is the new growth far surpasses the original growth. So just to understand. So you have a litra of onions. You've tithed the litra of onions. You now go ahead and replant the tithed litra of onions, and now you have new growth. The new growth far surpasses the old growth. Okay, so now what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, mis aseres lefikula. You have to tithe the entire amount. Now we'll say, what's the entire amount? The entire amount is the new growth plus the old growth. What does that tell you? That when new growth far surpasses old growth is batal to the new growth. Therefore, you have to tithe the entire growth, or you have to tithe the onion in its entirety. Take a look at the Ran for just a moment. Second wide line, mis aseres lefikula lefia gidulin v'ha'ikar. So we'll say when you look at the new onion, the new and improved onion, which is a combination ultimately again of the old growth and the new growth, you have to tithe the entire thing. the old growths and the new growths. What do you see from that? Alma asu gidulin hamichuyavim or mevatlin es ha'ikar hapater. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that new growth has the ability to be mevatel old growth. That's what we learn. Incredible. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Alma osam gidulin mevatlin ikar. We'll say, therefore, what do you see? And this is the phrase we're going to keep on saying. Therefore, gidulin, which represents the new growth, has the ability to be mevatel, to go ahead and literally bittel, to negate the ikar, the original primary growth. So we'll say really a fascinating case, which the Gemara says maybe not. So the Gemara wants to prove from this particular case that again, when you have a mixture of growths, old growth and new growth, if new growth far surpasses old growth, the entire entity is now halachically defined by the new growth. To which the Gemara says, Dilma l'chumra shayni. Gemara says maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe in general, it depends. When you're going to go l'chumra, we'll say that new growth is mevatel old growth. So we'll say, for example, in this case, it's l'chumra. Why is it l'chumra? Because let's remember again, in this case, the quote-unquote old growth was already tithed. The new growth was not tithed. So the Gemara is saying maybe l'chumra, I was neglected. I want to welcome back Rabbi Gedalia Rosenblum. Baruch Hashem was back from getting up from sitting Shiva. Mitzvah Gedalia Mishpacha should know incredible simchas in the future. Baruch Haba. So I'll say, so maybe we only take this approach, ultimately again, l'chumra. So in this case, remember again, it's l'chumra. Why? Because l'chumra will tell you that you have to retithe, well, I should say you have to tithe the entire mixture. Now, tithing the entire mixture by definition also means what? That you're going to be retithing the old growth. So maybe, the Gemara posits, maybe when do we say, and the Rose said the Lashon is, Gidulin mevatlin ikar. When do we say that new growth is mevatl old growth? Maybe that's only the chumrah. But when that would result in a kula, perhaps we would not hold that way. Now, I remember again, we're all of this is the derivative of the original case of Yishmael Ish Kfar Yama. So remember again, what was his case? He had a shemitah onion. You replanted it. Now it's year 8. What happens? Now you have year 8 growths, and in the case over here, the year 8 growths far surpassed the shemitah growths. So the shaila was, does the new growth have the ability to be mevatel the old growth? So the Gemara wants to try to bring a proof from this case, from this tithe case, the case of the onion that we just read over here. To which the Gemara says maybe over here it's different because if we say gidulin mevatlin ikar, that's l'chumra. That creates a stringency. But perhaps we wouldn't say gidulin mevatlin ikar in a case when it would yield a kula. To which the Gemara says, Ela minada. You're right. So let's try to resolve it from the following case. Disanya, all interesting cases. Disanya, Rabbi Shimon says, top of Nunches, called davar sheyesh lo matirin. So we'll say this is an interesting halacha in general. So halacha says like this: any item called davar sheyesh lo matirin means, or we'll say any item which can ultimately become mutter. We'll define just a moment. Any item that can become mutter, kigon. What's an example of this? Kigon, tevel. We'll say, remember again, tevel is untithed produce. Meiser sheni. Meiser sheni is the tie that you have to separate out in what? Bring up to Yerushalayim and eat it. Hegdish, consecrated item. Chadash, we'll say chadash refers to new grain prior to the offering of the omer. Lo nitnu bahen chachamim shir. So we'll say this is actually a fascinating halacha. Any item which, let me take a step back. There's a concept of bittul, right? What's the concept of bittul? Then if you have a prohibited item that falls into a mixture with a permitted item, as long as there is more permitted item than prohibited item, more davar heter than davar aser, permitted item than prohibited, then what? Then the prohibited item is batal. Its identity is negated in the mixture. Now, of course, what's the variable in that statement? The variable in the statement is the ratio of permitted item to prohibited items. Sometimes all you need is a simple majority. Sometimes you need 60 times more. Sometimes you'll need 200 times more. We'll discuss all of that. But that's the principle. That's the principle of bittul. What the Gemara is introducing us to is the fascinating idea. When does the principle of bittul apply? Well, it's something really interesting to talk about. Bittul is like a last case resort. Like it's the last thing that the halacha relies on to resolve a situation. If there is a different way to resolve a mixture situation, we don't rely on bittul. The door to rely on bittul. So what's an example of where there's another option? In what we call the case of a davar sheish l'matirin. So for example, I will say you could have a forbidden mixture right now, but there either that mixture over time will become permitted, or again, there are other steps you could take to permit the mixture without relying on bittul. So that's called. So what's an example of a permitted item getting mixed in, but yet you don't have to rely on bittul? The example that would be a davar sheish l'matirin, something that is prohibited now, but ultimately again will become permitted in the future. We'll say, by the way, when was the first time we saw this concept? A little Daf Yomi, not trivia, because nothing's trivial about Daf Yomi. When was the first time we saw this concept? First time we saw this concept in Shas was in Be'ah, in Maseches Be'ah. The concept ultimately again of a, remember again, the paradigmatic case of a Beitza Shenolda b'Yom. Right? You have an egg that was chicken-laid egg on Yom Tiv. That egg is prohibited on Yom Tiv. What happens if that egg gets mixed in with other eggs? Right? So let's say there's 100 times more permitted eggs than the one egg. Now obviously you can't tell which egg it is. What's the halacha? It's not batal. Why is it not batal, Rabbi say? Because remember, there's a very easy way to remedy this situation. How do you remedy the situation? Wait. Just wait. The base of Shnol to Yom Tov is only Asr on Yom Tov. Just wait the next day. And once the next day comes, by definition, everything is permitted. So that's an example of a davar sheish l'matirin. So I don't have to rely on bittul. If I could just wait a little bit. So the Gemara says, kol davar sheish l'matirin, any item that can become permitted. No, if you look at the Ran for just a moment, the top Ran on Chesed Dalaf, the Ran writes, kol davar sheish l'matirin can go in Tevel, shenis ariv b'chulin, v'yesh l'matirin, sheyachal ha'hafrish in makom acher. So we'll say, for example, Tevel, untithed produce that gets mixed in with other chulin, unconsecrated produce. So we'll say, that is the davar sheish l'matirin. Why is davar sheish l'matirin? Separate out Trumas and Maasros from somewhere else. Okay? So that's one case. Next case, the Ran goes on, Meiser Sheni v'Hekdish. So similarly again, if Meiser Sheni and Hekdish get mixed in with chulin, there's a way to remedy that as well. How do you remedy it? Redeem it. Or Chadash. I will say, remember again, if Chadash gets mixed in with other food product or the grain, well, how do you remedy it? Wait. Because the carbon omer will go ahead and permit the consumption. So I will say, so therefore again, in all of these cases, if these items get mixed in with something else, even if they're in a super majority of permitted item, they're not batal. Conversely, the chal davar she'ein lo matirin, but I will say, if you have an item that is asr, and the state of isser is never going to change, that's what we call a davar she'ein lo matirin. The very state of isser is not going to change. Kigon. What are some examples of this? Kigon, truma smaiser. So examples of this ultimately again would be truma smaiser, chala, arla, klaya, karen. So let's remember again. So truma, which is the portion separated from the kohen, truma smaiser, which is the portion that the Levi has to separate out for the kohen, chala, the portion we separate out from the dough for the kohen, arla, fruit of the first 3 years, klaya kareb, forbidden mixtures which grow inside of a vineyard. So we'll say in all of these cases, remember, the forbidden status of these items is never going to change, and there's nothing you could do to affect change in their forbidden status. So watch this. Let's say these items then get mixed in with other similar, like permitted items. Okay? So what's the halacha? So nasnu b'hem chachamim shir. Ultimately, again, I will say in this case, the Chachamim gave a shear for bittul. So we'll say in these cases, there is a bittul ratio. For example, we'll say, look at the Ran. It's almost right across on the Ran, on the left-hand side. Nastum and Chachamim shear shafilu nisarvu biminan betelin. So we'll say in these items, even if the items went ahead and got mixed in with like items, they are batal. For example, Truma smaiser v'chala b'meah. So for example, let's say in the cases of Truma or Truma smaiser or Chala, they are permitted in a ratio of 100 to 1. So 100 permitted items to 1 prohibited item. Arla, Klaya, Kem, Masayim. Arla, Klaya, Kem, if they get mixed with something permitted, ultimately they're batal in a ratio of 200 to 1. Good, fine. So we'll say, we're not getting into right now, just I'll mention it to you. In the world of mixtures, there are 2 different types of mixtures, right? There's min b'mino and min b'she'eno mino. When there's a mixture of 2 like items or a mixture of 2 dissimilar items. Often the ratio for bittul is higher in min b'mino and lower in min b'she'eno mino. But like I said, we're not going to delve into that right now. So the Gemara says, 1 second. So we'll say, so now we have a principle. By the way, just I just want to point out, this beauty of Daf Yomi is that also sometimes we see these concepts that are Shas concepts. So we'll say, this is a Shas concept. Any item, any forbidden item that has a way to remedy the forbidden status will not become batal. Because remember again, we only rely on bittul as a last-ditch effort. Bittul is what you rely on to permit a forbidden mixture when there's no other way to work this situation out. But if there's another way to remedy the Yisr, so therefore any item which ultimately has a different mechanism of becoming permitted, bittul doesn't work. Conversely, we call that a davar sheyesh lo matirin. It could become mutter through another mechanism. Conversely, if you have a davar she'en lo matirin, something that is usr, has an isr status, and that status cannot be remedied, right, in any way, ultimately, again, that item will become batal in a mixture of permitted item. How much hefter do you need? That depends on the item. Watch this. Okay, says the Gemara, Amrulo, so they said to him, this is Rabbi Shimon said, they said to Rabbi Shimon, Amrulo, Valo Shvius, Ein La Matirin, Velo Mostu B'Chacham Shir. What about Shemitah? Shemitah produce, I will say. Shemitah produce does not have a heter. Right? In other words, there is no way to rectify remember, something grows during Shemitah. Now I will say, just to be clear, when we say forbidden status, so remember again, you're allowed to consume Shemitah produce. But remember, Shemitah produce has Shemitah sanctity, which means it has to be treated and dealt with in a particular way. Is there some way to go ahead and remove Shemitah sanctity from fruit, from the item? The answer is no. So Shemitah produce is a davar she'in lo matirin. There's no way to permit it. So watch this. Valo shvius ein lo matirin. Yes, we'll say, so I would have thought, based on Rabbi Shimon's principle, we'll say, what should happen with Shemitah produce that gets mixed in with permitted produce? What should happen? It should be batal. Shibatal, because Shemitah produce is a davar she'en lo matirin. There is no other way to permit Shemitah produce. And Rabbi Shimon, you just said before that when there is no way to permit something, when something is a davar she'en lo matirin, it is batal in a mixture. Now, how much of the permitted mixture you need? Okay, that'll be the variable. So Shvius, we learned Valo Shvius in lo matirin, Velo nosta b'chacham shir disnan hashvius oseres b'chol shul b'mina. I will say because we learned that ultimately Shemitah produce prohibits a mixture, even in the smallest amounts. Amar Laheni said to them, "You're right. Afani lo amarti ela lebir." So he said, even I agree that Allah Lamaisa. When is this true? For the halacha of beer. We'll define what this means in just a moment. I both say, so a lot going on over here today. Beer is like this. Shemitah produce, the halacha is as follows. Anyone is permitted to take it. And not only take it, anyone is permitted to go ahead and collect it, harvest it, and store it in your home. But you're only allowed to store Shemitah produce in your home when it's readily available in the field. Once it's no longer readily available to the field, you're no longer permitted to store it. So once the produce is no longer ready, if you have anything stored in your house, you have to go ahead and take it out of the house. That's called beer. Kind of like beer, chametz, like destruction of chametz. So beer, you don't have to destroy it, but you have to remove it. You can no longer store it in your home. So Rabbi Shimon said, you're right. I only said this halacha when it came to beer. Aval la'achila, but ultimately, again, when it comes to consumption, ultimately, again, beno sein tam. It has to give here. So I'll say, what's happening over here? Take a look at the Ran for just a moment. The Ran is about 2, 4, 5 lines up from the 4 before it gets wide. So listen to this. So Amr lahem af heim lo amru el labir af heim lo amru shashviyas osaris b'choshu. When do we say that Shemitah produce has the ability to prohibit even in the smallest amount? B'mina ela le'inyan shetzarech lechal ataroves kodim habir d'cheivan she'efshar la'achlo havile kedavar sheyesh lo matirin. So we'll say, so listen to this. When it comes to Shemitah produce, what we said is like this. If you have Shemitah produce that gets mixed in with other items, what we meant to say was like this. That halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead, you have to ideally, the mixture should be consumed before the time of beer. before the time that the Shemitah produce has to be taken out from the home. That halacha l'maisa, since it can be consumed, ultimately it's like a davar sheish l'matirin. What he's essentially saying is that halacha l'maisa, Shemitah is a davar sheish l'matirin, because even if it gets mixed in with something else, it could be consumed. It just has to be consumed before the time of beer. Aval la'achila, first wide line in the Ran of the intermediate wide lines. Kilomar im nisarvu la'achar habir. Now, conversely, if you have Shemitah produce which gets mixed in with something else after the time of beer, shimyu asurin sheim yu osrin taruvasan lo sharu ba'achila. Ben b'mina ben shelo b'mina b'no same time. So I'll say, but yet after the time of the beer, halacha l'maisa, the mixture would be forbidden. What comes out over here? Alma gidulin einon nimshachen achar ha'ikar lios kamo. They both say the bottom line, what comes out for us from this discussion is that ultimately, again, growth of an item is not, the identity of growth does not follow the primary part. So, right, additional growths have the ability to have an independent identity than the ikar itself. He says, lios kamo di'ihachi heich tesa shvius begiduleha. So we'll say what comes out of this is that halacha l'maisa, if indeed you have a sixth year onion, ultimately again any additional growths. Now we'll say this is going from year 6 into year 7. So if you were to have a year 6 onion, and then there would be additional growth, additional growths, so 7th year growths, those 7-year growths, if they outnumber the original 6th year growth, ultimately turn this into Shemitah produce with all of its isurim of Shemitah associated with it. So I'll say, so this is a not long-winded, but this is a long way of ultimately proving the idea that halacha l'maisa, as the Mishnah said before, what we said before, gidulin mevatlin ikar. That halacha l'maisa, again, the growth does not take on the same identity as the primary item. To which the Gemara says, oh, this is not a good raya. It's not a good raya. V'dilma hanami l'chumra. Maybe this is a case of chumrah. So maybe the chumrah will say it, but l'kula we wouldn't say it. To which the Gemara says, the dilma hanami l'chumrah shiny. So ultimately, again, this will also be considered to be a case of chumrah, and that's why halacha l'maisa we say that. But maybe in a case of kula, we would not go ahead and subscribe to this idea. So we'll say we still have not resolved our issue. Again, picking up very interesting nuggets of information along the way, but have not been able to prove our assertion. Ela min hada pashta. Rather, let's answer it from the following case. This night. So we'll say, so remember, we're still on our primary question, which is, again, Yishmael's question. You go ahead and you take an onion which had a Shemitah bulb, and then you go ahead and you replant it. You write in year number 8, and in year number 8 now you have year 8 growths which far surpass the year 7 bulb. Does the growth have the ability to be mevatel the ikar, what we call gidulin mevatlin ikar? Does that work or not? So we still have not been able to resolve that. Rather, the Gemara says, pashta, this nan. Bitzalim, also, it's another interesting case here. Bitzalim shiyardu aleim gisham. So we'll say, just to frame the case, this is a situation, ultimately, again, of you have a Shemitah onion. If you take a look over here, it's 5 lines up from the bottom, in the Ran. So he says, Elaminada Pasha, the sign of B'tzalim Sha'arido Gesham, B'shvias Samchus. So listen to this. You have an onion, and it rained on the onion. Sha'adolem Geshamim, B'tzamchu. And I will say, what happens? So now it's the 7th year, rain falls on the onion, and the onion goes at Samchu, means it develops leaves. Im hayu ha'olin shalahen shchorin. If ultimately, again, the leaves that the onion develops are dark, asurin, ultimately, again, they're going to be asur. Horiku, if, however, they're lighter, paler, greener, ultimately, again, they're permitted. So we'll say, what's going on over here? Take a look at the Ran for just a moment. So the Ran says over here, Im hayu alin shalahen shchorin asurin, lav shchorin mamish, elenotin l'shachris. Now we'll say, the Gemara says over here, first of all, before we go on, take a quick look at the Rush, because the Rush qualifies this case a little bit. If you look in the Rush, right-hand column, 4 lines into the wide lines. So the Rush says, B'tzalim shiyard aleim geshamim, B'tzalim shal shishis shenichnesu l'shviyes v'tzamchu. So we'll say, so just to frame this is a 6th year onion. A 6th year onion that is heading now into the Shemitah year. So 6th year onion heading into the Shemitah year. Now what happens? It rains during year 7, and now the onion blossoms, right? The onion sprouts leaves. So now I have a 6th year growth going into year 7. Raining, now the onion is sprouting additional leaves. So what did the Gemara? So again, continue on in the Rush. The Rush says, Im hayu alein shchorin, if the leaves are black, then ultimately the onion is aser. What's the pshat? Kishabetzalim gidulin alin shalahen mishachrin v'nefshatin hilchach im yishchira biyadua shegadlu ma'at v'gidule isr asrun esa ikar betosefes kol shehu. So what's this? Very interesting. So if ultimately the leaves are black or dark, that shows that this is a real Shemitah growth, and therefore again, on both sides, the onion is going to be aser. Onion is going to be aser. Why? Because now this is considered to be what? A Shemitah onion. However, if the leaves themselves are lighter color, horiku mutarin, if the leaves themselves don't become dark, then there's not really a Shemitah growth that's occurred, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the onion is going to be permitted. Fine. Back to the Gemara for just a moment. Back to the Gemara. Good. Actually, the Ran says, I'm sorry, just the back and forth. Look at the Ran, 4 lines up from the bottom. Horiku mutarin, shekevan shemirokim, lav machmas yinikas akarka niskadal, ela machmas habatzal asmo. This is actually interesting. See, apparently it goes like this, that if halacha l'maisa, the leaves are dark, that shows that the growth that's happening in the onion actually is coming from the ground. If the leaves ultimately remain a paler color, that growth is coming from the onion, not coming from the ground. Another interesting fact over here. Shemitah growth is only prohibited when it comes from the ground. Shemitah growth that comes from the plant itself is not prohibited. Okay, so let's go back. Let's finish up this proof. So the Gemara says as follows. So now I have a year 6 onion, and now it's going into year 7. And what happens? It rained, and now the onion sprouted leaves. So if the leaves are dark, that shows that this is substantive growth that's coming from the ground, and therefore the onion will be aser. All right? If the leaves are light, that shows the growth came from the onion itself, not from the ground, and therefore the onion will be mutter. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus Omer, Rabbi Chanina says, Im yecholun litlosh ba'alin shalahen asurin. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus says, you know what it depends on? It depends on the strength of the leaves. If the leaves themselves are strong enough, that's what? That you could grab hold of the leaves and pull the onion out of the ground, asurin. Then ultimately again, the onion is asur, because that shows that there was substantive Shemitah growth. As the Gemara says, look at the Ran for just a moment, I'm sorry. From the bottom. So we'll say it makes a lot of sense, because if you could pull the onion out of the ground by the leaves, that shows that again there was real growth, substantive growth, and therefore halacha l'maisa, that Shemitah growth and its aser. Ukinegdan l'matzei shvius mutarin. I will say, by the way, whatever is going to be true for year 6 going into year 7 is also going to be true for what? Year 7 going into year 8. So in other words, if you have a year 7 onion, and now again that onion is still in the ground into year 8, and now it rains, and the onion sprouts leaves. So according to the first opinion, if the leaves are dark, then ultimately again that's considered to be a year 8 growth. If the leaves are lighter, it's a year 7 growth. According to B'chanei ben Antigonus, if the leaves that grow in year number 8 are strong enough to pull the onion out of the ground, that's called the year 8 growth. Okay, what do we see from here? What do we see here? We'll say, Lememra, the Gidule Heter Malin Es Ha'iser. So we'll say, what's the takeaway message from all of this? What's the takeaway message of all of this? Right? Like, I have no idea. Right? What's the takeaway message of all this? Right? Takeaway message of all this is that new growth, right? New growth has the ability to be mavatal old growth. Right? That's the takeaway. Without even delving into the details, here's what I know. That again, new growth has the ability to eclipse the identity of old growth. What we call the Gidule Heter Malin Es Ha'iser. Ultimately, so says you have new growth outnumbers. Outnumbers is the wrong word. What's the word? Not outnumbers. If new growth surpasses, right? If new growth surpasses old growth, then ultimately the identity of the item can be determined by new growth. That's what I get from this. To which the Gemara says, one second. V'dilma b'meduchin. So b'meduchan, excuse me. Maybe this is talking about a crushed onion. That's actually very interesting. If you take a look at the last line in the Ran, so the Ran says, "Don't dunachin." So shedach v'shacha kabet salim v'kevin dimiduchin ninhu grii v'lo memashchi gidulim basrayu. So it's very interesting. Maybe he's talking about a case of where the original onion itself was crushed, and now there's additional growth from. It's still obviously still on the ground, but there's additional growth from the onion. Maybe in a case where the primary onion is crushed, in that case, halacha l'maisa, everyone will agree that the primary item is less important, right? The primary item is batal, and that's when the new growth has the ability to determine the identity of the item. Okay? Eliminadas. Therefore, we'll say, fine. We still don't have an answer. We'll say, again, remember, Yishmael just came along with his little onion, and how do we know that Yishmael's small onion would spark all of this dramatic conversation? Which is, again, fundamental shaila. You have a primary item that has an identity. Now it has additional growth that has a different identity. Does the identity of the new growth have the ability to determine the total identity of the item? That's the shaila. We still haven't resolved it. Eliminadah. So let's resolve it from the following. The Sanya, we'll say I'm a base. The Sanya. Interesting case. A person, I will say, is pruning an item, pruning chasios. Now I will say, the Ran says over here, what's chasios? So the Ran says chasios is on the right hand side. Mefarish lekaman the chasios tavar she'in zaro kala kegon haluf hashum ba'avet salim. We're going to see this later on. But chasios means an item that has a bulb that doesn't disintegrate, right? A bulb that remains intact. Here's the case. A Jew is pruning chasios together with a kusi. Okay, what's the halacha? So let's remember again, we have our kusim, right? Our kusim are those individuals who again converted, but their conversion was somewhat suspect, right? So again, in general, their status is always in limbo. So what happens? What's the halacha? So you're pruning an item together with a kusi. So you're allowed to go ahead and eat achilas arai. So we'll say, what's achilas arai? That means a snack. Now the truth is that's not unique over here. In general, when you have not fully finished produce, you're allowed to go ahead and eat a snack even though they haven't been tithed. Okay? That's not unique over here. That's a general halacha. So ocha mehen arai, uma'asrin vadai, and they're definitely chayiv to go ahead and definitely chayiv to tithe it, right? Ultimately, again, because we assume, we'll say now, what's the chap over here? So because this is a kusi, we assume that kusim are not makbid on trumas and maishus. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, as a worker, you're allowed to go, as someone who's working, you're allowed to go ahead and eat from the item that you're working with, achilas arai. In fact, Rabbi, I just want to point out over here a quick look at the Rush. This is just I know this is a very technical daf today, but what's very exciting about a daf like this are the number of concepts that are coming out over here throughout these cases. So look at the Rush in the left-hand column for just a moment. The Rush is about 8 lines in. Ochel mehen achilas arai. So we'll say another fascinating idea. The Ran says, Kidin poel she'ochel b'malachto. In general, we'll say, what's the halacha? If you're a worker in a field, one of the rights the Torah gives you as a worker is to eat produce. You could snack, you could eat while you're going ahead and working. Right? Shu said, "Umutar le'achal arai midavar shelo nigmara malachto lemaiser." And you're allowed to go ahead and eat an achilas, right? You're allowed to go ahead and eat a snack for something that is not yet a finished produce product for meiser purposes. V'lo chayshinan shemakusi zara tevel gamor. The comments will say, so what do you have to be concerned about over here? Now I understand what's going on over here. So I will say, here's the case. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, just so you get the totality of this case. Imagine the following situation. I am a Jew, Baruch Hashem, right? And I am going ahead and pruning plants together with a kusi. Whose plants are we pruning? The kusis. Let's say, for argument's sake, what are we pruning? We're pruning onions. I didn't know that you prune onions, but let's assume you're pruning onions. So we'll say, so now what does the Gemara say? I'm allowed to go ahead and eat from some of the onion leaves, right? I'm allowed to eat from the onions, an achilas arai, just like a worker. Okay, what's the chiddush? We'll say, here's the chiddush. What do I have to be concerned about? Maybe the kusi took an onion that was tevel. In other words, he had an onion. He already had an onion. right? He untied a fully finished onion, right? Fully finished onion that he uprooted from the ground. And now, Teva, he didn't tithe it. What did he decide to do now? What did he decide to do? Replant the bulb. So I will say, when you replant Teva untied produce, right, the clock doesn't restart. That's called Tevel. If it's Tevel, I can't, no one can eat from that until it's tithed. So this is fascinating. So the Gemara says, if I'm pruning the Kusi's onion plants together with him, I have the ability to snack on the leaves as we're working, and I don't have to worry about that it's Tevel. Okay. Fine. Good. So the Gemara says like this. So we'll say, so now again, we'll see exactly why this is being brought down over here, and what exactly it has to do with our case. Now, the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, if you have a Jew who is unfortunately suspect in not properly observing Shemitah, L'masei Shvius mutter. Any produce he had on after Shvius, right? So in other words, his 8th year produce is mutter. Now watch this, right? In both cases, why is it mutter? Rabbi say it must be because Lememra digidule heter ma'alin esa'eser. Maybe because Rabbi say in both cases, what do we say? That any permitted growth far surpassed the prohibited growth. Rabbi say, by the way, we can apply this in both cases. Because maybe even if the Nachri, right, the Kusi, even if the Kusi did replant the onion bulb, what do I say again? There's a lot more onion over here. So there's more permitted onion than prohibited onion, right? And therefore, again, I could snack on the leaves. Same thing in the Shemitah case. Halacha l'maisa again, even if I have a Jew who I know does not keep Shemitah, comes year number 8, I can go ahead and eat his produce. You know why? Because the new growth, which is year 8 growth, far surpasses the year 7 growth. So what do you see from both of these cases? Ultimately, again, that new growth has the ability to go ahead and far surpass, or I should say, be mavatal, prohibited old growth. One second. Maybe we're talking about over here, the items in question are items where the primary bulb disintegrates. To which the Gemara says, no. So the Gemara says, Hatanya, elu chasios. So both says, now we got, that's why I gave you the end a little bit before. I jumped ahead. What are chasios? Kigon haluf, v'hashum, v'habitzalim. So both say these are all items. Luf is something in the onion family. So you have luf, shum is garlic, bitzalim, onions, which are all items, we'll say what we call she'ein zaro kala, where ultimately, again, the initial bulb does not disintegrate. I've dilma b'meduchanin. Maybe we're talking about a case where we'll say, where maybe let's say the onion was crushed. And as we said before, if the initial bulb was crushed, everyone agrees that therefore it doesn't have prominence, right? And therefore, again, in that case, and maybe that's the case where the additional growths will go ahead and determine the identity. To which the Gemara says, Chashud al hashviyas katani. To which the Gemara says, I will say, the Gemara talks about this guy who is Chashud al hashviyas. Ultimately, again, he is suspect. Look at Rashi. Look at the Rush. Look at the Ran. The Ran is 5 lines up from before it gets right. Chashud katani velo tarach bahachi. So we'll say, ultimately, again, if we're talking about a guy who's not really observing the halachos of shviyas, of shemitah, he's not going to take the time to crush the bulb so that it doesn't have primary importance, and therefore the new growths will be mevatel the old growths. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, I just want to point out what's happened over here. Look at, you see the Ran, chashud katani? The Ran says, chashud katani, v'lo tarach bahachi. If we're talking about someone who is chashud, who is suspect in not properly observing Shemitah, he's not going to take the time to crush the initial bulb, so that it should become bottled to the additional growths. Now look at the rest of the Ran. Hilchach, if sheteilan bayon, the asu gidulin shel shminis, umevaklin ikar shel shviyas. Rabosai, it sounds like over here, this is an incredible shechiyanu v'kimanu v'giyanu. It sounds like that we have just reached resolution to our question. Rabosai, specifically from this last case, because what was this last case? You have a Jew who unfortunately is chashud, is suspect of not keeping Shemitah, right? What's the halacha then in his 8th year produce? I will say, l'matzei shviyas mutter. In year number 8, you are permitted to consume his produce. Now, what that means is, in year 8, you're allowed to go ahead and consume produce that was in the ground year 7, still in the ground year 8. Why are you permitted to consume his produce on year 8? Why? Because we assume that the new growth, year 8 growth, surpasses the amount of year 7 growth, and therefore again, gidulin malin es ha'ikar. The new growth is mevatel the old growth. So Rabbosai, after a very long, block-long journey, it sounds like we have reached the finish line, and Allah Lamaisa, that's not the Gemara said. So we see it. That's it. New growth, gidulin malin es ha'ikar. New growth has the ability to be mevatel old growth. So the Gemara says, one second. So let me tell it to you to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yonasan. So we'll say, okay, this sounds like it's a refutation of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yonasan. That I will say ultimately again, who said on Nunzainam days, they spoke about the case of the grafting, who said on Nunzainam days that ultimately again, new growth cannot be mevatel old growth. So it sounds like against the Gemara says, Rabbi Yitzchak, no. Rabbi Yitzchak says no. In fact, it's not the case. I will say, Shan Yishvius. Rabbi say, remember again, where did the Gemara seem to bring like this final conclusive proof from? Where did the Gemara bring it from? From the case of Shemitah. Right? You remember I want to say, like the final like resounding proof was the case of Shemitah. What happened in the case of Shemitah? What did the Gemara say? You have a guy, a Yisrael, a Jew, who's suspect on not observing the halachos of Shemitah. So therefore again, he has forbidden 7-year produce. That 7-year produce, that Shemitah produce remains in the ground into year number 8. What's the status now of his year 8 produce? What's the status? Mutter. So the Gemara said, what do you see from here? New growth is mavatal old growth. To which the Gemara says, one second. Your raya is from Shemitah. Shemitah is different. Hoil v'isura al yidei karka, betelosa nami al yidei karka. Shabbosai, this is a pretty dramatic idea. What the Gemara wants to suggest is Shemitah is different. Why is Shemitah different? Because since the Isra of Shemitah comes through Karka, therefore ultimately again, the Bittul comes through Karka as well. So we'll say what we're actually going to do is I'm going to leave you a little bit of a cliffhanger. We're going to leave that piece over here. I don't know how I had the thought that we're going to get in the Silas Yisharim today, but all right, good. It's good to dream. These are the parashiyos of dreams. I want to say, so again, so Lamaisa, here's where we're holding, right? I want to leave you on the thought over here that we've reached resolution. The proposed resolution that the Gemara suggests over here is that new growth can be mevatel old growth. Where did the Gemara kind of deliver that final proof from? The case of Shemitah. The Yisrael who's suspect with not observing Shemitah, yet his 8th year produce is permitted. What the Gemara is essentially going to say is, no, this is not a good proof. Why? Because Shemitah is going to be different. Why Shemitah is different? In the Hashem Abosai, tomorrow's daf. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. David, Jerry, Eretz Yisrael contingent, great to see you guys. Lichtige Chanukah.